Scotland's prisons have a fascinating story to tell, and none more so than Peterhead Prison. Prior to this prison being constructed, prisoners were incarcerated in numerous jails the length and breadth of Scotland and the United Kingdom. These jails simply incarcerated the criminals for long periods of time. And for many crimes, from theft through to murder, capital punishment was the order of the day. As sentences became less harsh, the jails became extremely overcrowded. Therefore, penal colonies were created in the Americas and Australia. In the 1800s, England created convict prisons where the sentence was back-breaking hard labour, including quarrying, the building of roads, and working on the dockyards. Sentences could last from a few weeks to years. As time passed and the shipment of convicts to penal colonies was in decline, Scottish prisoners were transported to English convict prisons to serve their time. In 1877, with the creation of the Board of Commissioners for Prisons, it was noted that while Scotland contributed her share to the costs of maintaining convicts, England had the whole benefit. Consequently, it was proposed that Scotland should have the use of its own prison for convicts, some 600 to 650 of whom laboured in England. 1884 saw a parliamentary subcommittee appointed to decide on the most suitable location for the construction of a harbour of refuge, with its adjacent convict prison to provide labour for the project. The shortlist was narrowed to Montrose or Peterhead. The 1886 Harbour of Refuge Act allowed the building of a prison outside the town beside Inverness and adjacent to the Admiralty development at Salthouse Head. With the land purchased for £5,000, the cost of construction was estimated between £30,000 and £40,000. In keeping with the practice of the time, the contractor built the first block of cells, the perimeter wall, and the necessary ancillary buildings of the prison. The convicts were then engaged on the completion of the rest of the prison and on the building of staff quarters. Railway lines were laid between the Admiralty Yard, the breakwater, and the quarry, which was opened at Stirling Hill around 2 miles distant from the prison. This railway itself was unique, being the first nationalised railway line in the United Kingdom. Convict chain gangs were transported via the railway in barred carriages each morning, where they quarried the renowned Peterhead red granite, which was then loaded onto goods wagons and transported back to Salthouse Head for construction of both the breakwater project and the prison. This back-breaking hard labour, patrolled by armed guards, continued for 10 hours each day. As Scotland's only convict prison, the institution was run on rules imported from England. Civil guards carried rifles and bayonets, while the warders wore naval-style cutlasses, prisoners not being allowed to approach closer to a warder than a drawn cutlass length. Prisoners could also be lashed with the cat-o'-nine tails, bound in irons, put on bread and water, and be shut in a special silent cell. This was a box-like cell built within a larger cell, each shut with solid doors, ensuring the complete isolation of the prisoner. To some, those may have seen the good old days, but prisoners, despite the armaments and the punitive sanctions available to authority, still escaped, attacked warders, and even tried to throw them off the quarry rim. The prison was officially opened on 7th August 1888, with the arrival of the first convicts. The prison was originally designed to hold 208 prisoners, but by the end of 1888, there were 114 convicts in the prison. Numbers soon increased, with 455 inmates by 1911. More buildings were completed in 1909, 1960 and 1962, when occupancy was 362. From the outset, life as a convict followed a hard regime. Many notables have paid their debt in the prison, some being the hardest and most brutal characters this country has had the misfortune of conceiving. However, the prison warder then, later prison officers or POs, had the unenviable fortune of dealing with these undesirables. They were confronted with gang warfare within the walls, extreme physical and mental abuse and violence, hostage situations, the dirty protests, and stabbings of fellow officers. No words can come close to describing the life of these persons. Rule changes in 1923 relaxed the hardline prison regime. All prisoners, excepting those undergoing punishment, were then to receive a mattress on admission to prison. More frequent letters were allowed, and prisoners awaiting trial were to be allowed to smoke while on exercise. Games such as football were allowed, and physical training was developed. Educational classes were to be conducted, with many subjects taught beyond the stage of elementary level. Over the next 20 to 30 years, hard labour and leg irons were abolished, but this did very little to ease hardships for both prisoner and prison officers in Peterhead. From 1945 to 1960, only 2 years passed without at least one escape, 1947 and 1956. In the 1950s, the infamous, or in his case maybe famous, Johnny Romensky escaped 4 times, once in 1952 and 3 times in 1958, in February, October and December. As the years progressed, the prison improved its record on escapes. The 1960s were troubled times with violence and disturbances, and the 1970s for Peterhead Prison did not get easier. 1972 saw the first mass rooftop protest, when 170 prisoners spent 2 days on the hospital block roof. This was followed in later years by further rooftop protests, mass hunger strikes, barricades in cells, firebomb attacks, and many attacks on the prison officers. 1982 was the year that dirty protests started seriously. Copying the Irish style, prisoners refused to wear prison clothing and smeared excrement over their persons and around their cells. In January 1984, there was a riot and an 18-hour rooftop protest by 12 prisoners, which was brought to an end by riot-equipped officers storming the barricades. 1984 also saw the opening of new facilities in Peterhead Prison, with a 10-cell unit for difficult prisoners. Then, in 1985, a breakout attempt from the tailor's shop led to a number of staff being taken hostage. In December, HM Prison's Inspectorate praised staff and the regime at the prison. In September 1987, at one of the halls in Peterhead Prison, 46 prisoners rioted, holding 2 officers hostage, and a siege lasting 105 hours ensued. The most seriously injured of the 2 officers was released early on in the tragedy. 43 of the prisoners also surrendered. The remaining officer, in the hands of 3 prisoners, was humiliated and terrorized. The siege only ended with an assault by members of the SAS, which released the officer alive, but with a long route of recovery to be travelled. Since those days, the role of Peterhead Prison has changed, with a reduction of its difficult prisoner role and a sharper focusing of management on those prisoners in smaller numbers. The major role of the institution became the management of vulnerable prisoners, with sex offenders undergoing programs to challenge their offending. The final chapter was written in December 2012, when Peterhead Prison closed its doors for the final time as HMP Grampian was nearing completion. The historical tie between Peterhead and the prison will, however, never be severed, an unexpected partnership which has become part of the very fabric of the town.